Imagine waking up tomorrow and half your neighbors have simply disappeared. Not by war, not by earthquake, but by something invisible that traveled from city to city, killing faster than any army. In 1348, this wasn't imagination. It was Monday. The Black Death killed 200 million people in just 4 years. It changed the world forever. And you're about to discover how a single flea caused the greatest apocalypse in human history. But before you understand how the world died, you need to see how it lived. Forget everything you know about comfort. Forget clean water, hospitals, medicine. In 1348, Europe wasn't a continent. It was a cemetery waiting to happen. Imagine living in a house the size of your bathroom with no windows, no heating, your family, your chickens, your goats, all in the same room. The smell, urine, feces, sweat, and death mixed together for generations. Are you sick? There's no doctor. There's a barber with a dirty knife who will open your veins because he believes your blood is rotten. Anesthesia, a bite on a piece of wood. Need water. Hope the well isn't contaminated with the waste they dumped yesterday. Better drink wine. Even children did that. And the food, moldy bread, rotten meat, vegetables, literally grown in human dung. Famine was so common that each region had its own name, but the worst part wasn't the poverty, it was the ignorance. People died from diseases that today you can cure with an aspirin. They believed earthquakes happened when God was angry, that diseases came from bad air. Europe in 1348 was a continent of illiterates, hungry, and desperate people. Kingdoms in constant war, children dying before the age of 5, adults old at 40. They didn't know it, but the killer was already on his way and would find the perfect target. October 1347, a ship arrives in Sicily. Inside, the end of the world. Imagine the scene. A Genoese ship approaches the port, but something is wrong, very wrong. There are no shouts of joy from the sailors. There is no movement on the deck, only silence. When the authorities boarded the ship, they found hell, dead sailors scattered across the deck, others in agony, with black balls the size of eggs sprouting from their necks, vomiting blood, delirious, begging for death. They tried to quarantine the ship, too late. Death had already leaped ashore, invisible, silent, lethal. What they didn't know is that they were facing the most efficient killer in human history, the Pestis bacterium, a bacterium 1,000 times smaller than a grain of sand, yet capable of toppling empires. Forget everything you know about war. This bacterium didn't need an army. It didn't need weapons. It had something better, a perfect transportation system. Fleistini vampires that lived in the blood of rats. When a flea bit an infected rat, the bacteria multiplied in its stomach until it completely blocked it. The flea, desperate and hungry, began biting anything that moved. Rats died, fleas jumped onto humans, and the cycle of death began. But here's what made it all worse. Rats were literally everywhere, on ships, in houses, in barns, in churches. Medieval Europe was a rat's paradise, and consequently, a flea's paradise. The plague traveled at the speed of trade. Every merchant ship was a biological missile, every caravan a vehicle of death, every fair a bomb waiting to explode. Sicily fell in weeks. Then it was Genoa's turn, then Venice, then Florence. Like human dominoes collapsing in succession, the wealthy fled to their country houses, taking their belongings, their clothes, their servants, and unknowingly, taking their fleas with them. And then began what no one imagined possible. In 7 hours, you could go from healthy to dead. So, the first day you wake up with a headache, no big deal. Maybe it's yesterday's wine. You go to work normally, talk to your neighbors, hug your children, unaware that you're already a living dead man. The second day, the fever hits like a runaway train. Your body burns from the inside, but you shiver with cold. And then you feel something growing under your arm, in your groin, on your neck. Bulges, black swellings the size of apples, hard as rock, painful as hell. Your skin stretches until it almost bursts. You can't move your arm, can't walk properly. The third day, you're vomiting blood. Black, coagulated blood, tasting of iron and death. Your breath smells like rotting flesh. Your feces are liquid, dark. You're literally rotting alive. Your nails turn blue, your lips turn purple. Your skin develops black spots as if you've been burned from the inside. That's why they called it the Black Death, because death painted you black before taking you. But the worst part isn't the physical pain, it's the delirium. You see things that aren't there, hear voices, scream at people who died years ago. Your mind disintegrates along with your body, and then, silence. This happened house by house, street by street, city by city. In Florence, 5,000 people died a day. In Paris, more than 800. In London, so many they stopped counting. Doctors were the first to die. They wore masks with bird beaks, thinking it would protect them. They stuffed their beaks with aromatic herbs, believing the bad air caused the disease. It didn't work. Nothing worked. They tried bloodletting. They tried burning the wounds with red-hot irons. They tried prayers, potions, amulets. Some doctors even recommended that people sleep standing up because they believed the plague struck when you lay down. Others told them to run naked through the streets shouting mantras, or to eat crushed gemstones, or to drink virgin urine. Medieval medicine was a cruel joke in the face of real death. Cities became death traps. The more people lived together, the faster the plague spread. Markets closed, workshops stopped, schools emptied, and the sound of the cities changed. There was no more laughter, conversation, or music, only moans, screams, and the constant sound of bells ringing for the dead. And then something began that no one was prepared for. The bodies piled up faster than they could bury them. Entire families disappeared within a week. Whole neighborhoods became ghost towns. Gravediggers were the first to give up. They died faster than they could dig. Families tried to bury their own dead. But when you're burying your father today and your mother tomorrow, where do you find the strength to carry on? In Florence, they opened communal pits the size of football fields and layered the body, as if constructing a macabre lasagna. Earth bodies, no names, no prayers, no dignity. The smell was unbearable. Rotting flesh mixed with burnt lime. Flies covered the cities like black clouds. Wild dogs roamed the streets, eating whatever they could find. And then society simply stopped. Bakers died. There was no more bread. Blacksmiths died. There were no more tools. Soldiers died. There was no more order. Priests died. There was no more hope. Laws meant nothing. Who would arrest you? Who would judge you? Who would care? Abandoned houses were looted, women attacked, children abandoned in the streets, money lost its value. What good were gold coins when there was nothing to buy? When the merchants were dead, when the roads were abandoned, families disintegrated. In Florence, the writer Boccaccio described how parents abandoned sick children, how children fled from infected parents, how husbands left wives to die alone. Self-love trumped family love, he wrote. Entire villages disappeared from the map. They weren't destroyed by war, they simply ceased to exist. Everyone died. Empty houses, abandoned fields, only the wind blowing where life once stood. The numbers are astonishingly real. In England, 60% of the population died. In France, 50%. In Germany, 40%. In Europe as a whole, between 75 and 200 million people simply ceased to exist. To understand the scale, imagine that from one moment to the next half of your country disappeared. Half your friends, relatives, colleagues, half the shops, schools, hospitals, half of everything you know. It was as if a meteor had struck civilization. But it wasn't a meteor, it was a flea. And when people realized that neither God, nor kings, nor doctors could save them, something terrible happened in the human mind. Imagine watching half the world die without explanation. Your mind breaks. And when millions of minds break at the same time, something far worse than the plague itself is born. Collective madness. First came the flagellants, crowds of people marching from town to town, whipping themselves until they bled, whips with metal spikes ripping their backs, blood running down the streets like red rivers. They believed that God was punishing humanity for its sins, and that only through extreme pain, through self-inflicted torture, could they appease divine wrath. Imagine hundreds of naked people, covered in blood, shouting prayers as they mutilated themselves, children watching their parents tear themselves apart, entire families joining the procession of madness. But this was only the beginning. People needed a culprit with a face, and they found one. The Jews. They poisoned the wells. The crowds screamed. They made a pact with the devil. They brought the curse upon us. It didn't matter that Jews died of the plague at the same rate as Christians. It didn't matter that there was no logic. Logic had died along with reason. What followed was one of the greatest genocides in medieval history. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned, alive in a single night. In Mainz, the entire Jewish community was massacred. In Cologne, Jewish homes were burned down with families inside, men, women, children, babies all burned, stoned, beaten to death by neighbors they had previously greeted on the street. But it didn't stop with the Jews. Anyone who was different became a target. Gypsies, beggars, outsiders, people with physical disabilities. Even lepers were persecuted as if one could be more cursed than the rest. Healers became witches. Women who knew how to prepare medicinal herbs were tortured until they confessed to pacts with demons. Tens of thousands died in the fires of the Inquisition. Paranoia was total. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Children accused parents. Husbands cheated on wives. Any suspicious look, any strange behavior, any attempt to protect oneself from the disease could be interpreted as witchcraft. And then something even more disturbing emerged. The death cults, groups that celebrated the plague as a liberation, who held orgies in cemeteries, who drank the blood of the dead, believing it would make them immune. Some groups began practicing ritual cannibalism. Others committed mass suicide, jumping off cliffs or hanging themselves from trees. Entire families chose to die together before the plague tore them apart. The church itself, which was supposed to bring comfort, panicked. Priests abandoned their parishes. Bishops fled to isolated monasteries. The Pope locked himself in Avignon and received no one. Prayers turned into screams of despair. Masses became sessions of mass hysteria. People fell to the ground, convulsing, speaking in tongues, believing they were possessed. Europe became a continent of lunatics. People who had lived normally just a day before now roamed the streets, raving, prophesying the end of the world, attacking anyone who crossed their path. For decades, the word plague was enough to provoke massacres. All it took was someone sneezing in public for a mob to lynch them. All it took was a spot on the skin to be burned alive. Civilization had entered a state of war with itself. They weren't fighting disease. They were fighting shadows, ghosts, anything that gave them the illusion of control. The plague killed the medieval world, but what came after changed everything. When the chaos finally calmed, when the last screams of madness echoed, when the smell of death began to dissipate, something extraordinary happened. The world that rose from the ashes was completely different. Imagine, half the population had died, but the fields still needed to be cultivated, the houses still needed to be built, the trade still needed to take place. And suddenly, for the first time in history, there were fewer people than available labor. The peasants, who for centuries had been slaves to the earth, woke up in a world where they held the power. There were no longer enough feudal lords to control them. There were no longer enough soldiers to force them. There was no longer enough system to keep them imprisoned. "I will no longer work for free," said one French peasant to his lord. "I will no longer sleep in the barn," said another. "I will no longer bow before you," said a third. And do you know what happened? The feudal lords accepted. For the first time in 1,000 years, the poor could negotiate, demand wages, choose where to work, leave one estate and move to another. Feudalism, which seemed eternal, collapsed overnight. In England, peasants began wearing colorful clothing, previously forbidden by law. In France, they began to eat meat regularly. In Germany, they began to own land. But the most profound change occurred in the minds of the people. For years, the church had taught that God controlled everything, that kings ruled by divine right, that suffering was sacred, that questioning authority was a sin. But then came a disease that killed bishops and beggars alike, that ignored prayers and relics, that made it obvious that neither God, nor kings, nor popes had real control over anything. Absolute authority died along with the plague. Universities began to question sacred texts. Artists began to paint the real world, not just religious themes. Merchants began to challenge church laws on lending. Knowledge ceased to be the exclusive property of monks. Lay people began to learn to read. Women began to participate in business. Young people began to question their elders. And then something happened that changed everything forever. The invention of the printing press. Gutenberg created his press in 1440, less than 100 years after the plague. It was no coincidence. In a world where authority had been questioned, where knowledge had been democratized, where people wanted answers, the printing press was inevitable. Books spread like a plague, but this time a plague of knowledge. Ideas that once took decades to cross Europe now spread in months. Cities grew exponentially. Without the feudal structure, people migrated to urban centers. Florence became the cradle of the Renaissance. London became a commercial powerhouse. Paris became an intellectual center. Capitalism arose from the ashes of feudalism. Merchants, once controlled by feudal lords, could now accumulate wealth. Banks emerged. Contracts became more important than oaths of loyalty. Even art changed completely. Before the plague, almost all art was religious. After the plague, artists began to paint real people, real landscapes, real emotions. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, all children of a world the plague had transformed. Science exploded. Without the absolute authority of the church, Thinkers like Copernicus were able to question that the Earth was the center of the universe. Galileo could gaze at the stars. Newton could discover the laws of physics. Medicine itself was revolutionized. The plague had shown that bloodletting and prayers didn't work. Doctors began to study real anatomy. Hospitals began to focus on healing, not on saving the soul. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of progress was born. For 1,000 years, people believed the world had been in constant decline since the lost paradise, that the best was in the past, that change was dangerous. But the plague proved that radical change was not only possible, it was necessary, that the world could be different, that humanity could evolve. In less than 200 years ago, this mindset produced discoveries that changed everything. America was discovered, gunpowder spread across Europe, the telescope was invented, blood circulation was mapped. The Black Death not only killed the medieval world, it gave birth to the modern world. The Black Death wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. Do you know what's scariest about everything you just saw? It's not that it happened 700 years ago, it's that it could happen again. In fact, it's already happening. 2020, a virus emerges in China. Within months, the entire world stops. Borders close, economies collapse, millions die. You remember, don't you? But here's what few noticed. All the patterns of the Black Death repeated themselves. Exactly the same. Initial denial. It's just the flu. It won't reach us. We're prepared. It's familiar. A search for culprits. Asians attacked in the streets. Politicians accusing other countries. Conspiracy theories about laboratories. The same collective madness. 1348. Institutional collapse. Hospitals overwhelmed. Healthcare systems failing. Governments in panic. Just like when the plague reached medieval cities. And the same fatal arrogance. We're more advanced than them. We're smarter. We have modern science. But when the moment of truth arrived, what did we do? Exactly what they did in 1348. We panicked. We looked for culprits. We denied reality. The only difference is that in 2020 we were lucky. COVID-19 killed only 7 million people. A pestis bacterium killed 150 million. What would happen if the next virus had the lethality of the plague and the transmissibility of COVID? Do you think our civilization is more resilient than the medieval one? Think again. Our society is more interconnected, more dependent on technology, more fragile than any civilization in history. A virus that takes down the internet could be more devastating than the Black Death. Without a global positioning system, without communications, without banking systems, without anything that keeps our world running. And you know what? It's the most terrible truth. We haven't learned anything. As soon as COVID-19 passed, we cut funding for pandemic research again, closed laboratories, and fired experts, just as they did after the Black Death. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of the next pandemic may be our last, because there's something you need to understand. The Black Death wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern. Justinian in the 6th century, the Black Death in the 11th century, the Spanish flu in the 20th century, COVID in the 20th century. They're coming more frequently and becoming more dangerous. So I ask you, when the next plague comes and it will you repeat the same mistakes of 1348? Or will we finally learn from history? The choice is ours. Time is running out. If this video made you think differently about the world we live in, like it and share it with someone who needs to see it, because the next pandemic may not give us a second chance. And if you want to know about other times when humanity was nearly wiped out, subscribe to the channel, because history is full of warnings we ignore. Remember, knowing history isn't about the past, it's about surviving the future, because those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and next time we might not be so lucky.